So thank you very much for inviting me. It's been very good to be here. I'm talking about intergenerational mobility in Norway, and the focus of this presentation is on intergenerational mobility, fathers and sons, through the industrial transition, or the many things that happen over a horizon of 150 years, and how social mobility changes in such a transition. So, as you know, there has been large changes in what the economy looks like. For example, Norway used to be a country of farmers, and it's not anymore. You see the same in many other countries. There's been an extremely large growth in aggregate productivity in most ways of measuring that. Also, at least in Norway, there's been huge convergence between regions of the country. So it used to be cities were extremely different from the countryside, both in what people did and how they behaved and how much money they made. That's disappeared to a large extent. And of course, income inequality has fallen a lot also in Norway from the 19th century to at least to the 1980s. And then all the things have happened after that. So the question today then is how this transition affected social mobility. So we know some things about income inequality, for example, through the top incomes, which maybe Facundo will touch on later. We don't know so much about how social mobility has changed. We could maybe conjecture that it would go up because income inequality has fallen and there's more equality, but that's what I want to look at. So why is Norway interesting here? We have, of course, excellent evidence from Great Britain and the United States that sort of established a development for these countries. But every country is special, but Britain is special because it was the leader in many ways. It industrialized very early, so the early British data is still from a fairly industrialized society where people work in wage jobs and, well, it's different from today, but not the same way as many other European countries. The United States, of course, had extensive immigration and a lot of land, so this is also talked about as an explanation to why mobility was very high in the United States in the 19th century. And I think it's useful to have some more evidence on sort of old European countries that went through a development process and how this mobility changed through this. So Norway made a transition from a very rural and very remote society to one of the most well-off societies in Europe in terms of income and income distribution. It was relatively inegalitarian, as far as we know, in the 19th century. So the consensus among historians has been that there's been low mobility in the 19th century, but we don't really have any quantitative evidence on that from before. It's more like, well, look at these people. They had small marginal farms, and there were some large farms where people inherited over generations. And of course, the thing about Norway is that we industrialized fairly late, but the state building process started a bit earlier. So that means we have good data for points in time where society was still fairly, I should maybe not say backward, but backward. Okay. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk about data that I've compiled on the occupation distribution and the intergenerational occupation mobility in Norway between 1865 and 2011. I'm going to find that 19th century Norwegian mobility was low, at a similar level to what Longeferry find for the United Kingdom, and that I find a large increase in social mobility in Norway over time, except if you look for the farms, which is a recurring thing in these occupational mobility studies. I'll explain more about that.
Are you going to count migration as part of mobility? Social mobility? I mean, there's a huge out-migration in Norway, right?
Yes.
In the 19th century.
Yes, so I'm not matching to the United States like Abramitsky and Bustan do, but I'm going to break the country up into high and low immigration regions. I'm going to find that there's not that much difference. So that suggests that these results are not driven by immigration.
I mean, those who stayed behind. I'm just saying there was a huge upward mobility, wasn't there, into these people getting farms in the Midwest and so on?
Yeah, for the people who left, there was a huge upward mobility. Yeah. And those are not in my sample because I don't match them. But you could also worry that it's a problem because people left and there's a lot more room left for the people remaining. So that drives the mobility. But that doesn't seem to be the case as far as I can tell. Yeah. But of course, in any welfare perspective, you have to take this into account, that a lot of people left and they're not in the sample. And that's maybe more important in this period because the volume is much larger than we see in later periods. Yeah. And as far as I can tell, this increase is not driven by any geographic convergence. That was maybe something I thought about before I started, that would be the case. And also try to do an income inequality interpretation of this that I will get to later. And I find that the contribution to inequality in dynasties is not that big, but I'll get to that later. So literature has been extensively reviewed in this conference. I'm not going to do that over again, but Long and Fair is an important reference here. They look at United States and Great Britain in the 19th and 20th century, and I think we can summarize it as mobility used to be higher in the US. It's not so anymore. Clark, if you read him just talking about 2 generations over time, he finds a relatively stable relationship in wealth mobility. So he finds no large changes, and he looks at the UK, so that's in a sense consistent with this paper. Then there's the Sweden studies, which also do, while they do many generations, they also do 1 generation over time. They find no big changes over time, but they only look at very small areas. So they have constructed databases over small cities or small rural regions, and then they can't account for all the large migration to the cities. And there's a lot of things happening in society in this period. So that's sort of a smaller version of the argument that Heckman made, that they only have very small regions and they don't know what happened to the people who moved to the city or who sort of migrated to modernity. Okay. So social mobility, the consensus seems to be that it's high in Scandinavia today. By Bjørklund and others have looked at this. It should say high. I'm terribly sorry about that. No, low, sorry. Yeah. So low, this is high mobility. There's a study by Bratsberg and co-authors, 2 studies from 2005 and 2007, find small changes, small increases, but not very large changes in mobility for the cohorts born from the 50s onwards. Kjell Salvones is going to talk later today about changes in mobility starting with 1930s cohorts and show an increase for them. But there's really nothing quantitatively further back in time. And then there's also some work on sibling correlation in Sweden, which indicates increasing mobility. But the sociologists who looked at occupational mobility seem to have a consensus that for the modern period, the changes are only moderate. And of course, Hendren and co-authors have put this geographical variation on the map for the United States. And we would expect there to be some of that also for Norway. So what I do, and as far as I know, this is the first paper that uses full count, or is based on full count samples going over 150-year periods. So some of you might be aware of the Norwegian registry data. That's basically the source of my 1960 to 2011 paper. But then we have the historical samples that are digitized by the Norwegian National Archives in a way that looks similar to the US digitalizations, except they have done it for full count censuses for 1865, 1900, and 1910, which I use today. They're also coded on occupational and geographical covariates. And this is the same data that Abramitsky and co-authors used for 1865 and 1900. So because there is no information on income or education in these data sets, I'm going to talk about occupation and for the entire presentation today. I'm also going to use some data on occupation mean incomes and some regional covariates, but there's a challenge of getting that for the entire time period. But there's some of that as well. So my observation structure is basically like this. So you have 2 censuses.
You're going to talk about whether the concept of occupation is a meaningfully stable construct. I mean, I can be like a farmer in 1850 is very different from a farmer in 2014, say in the Midwest. Say, I don't know, I would guess that's mobility upward, even within the job of being a farmer. Right? So just because the way the nature of the occupation will change. I don't know if that's important empirically or how you adjust for it if it is.
As I'm not adjusting for it. And it's important, but
just conditions of work, for example. I mean, just the invention of the plow and things like that in agriculture would be a huge difference, right? Or like tractors and so forth.
Yes, so and I think
you do get that through income, right? I mean,
Income,
you're going to do this inequality stuff, and you have the prices of occupations. That's sort of like a proxy for what you're getting at.
Right, but I mean, you could stay in the same job and have social mobility, right? Or have at least occupational, a kind of hedonic mobility, because you actually are now in much better conditions. Sure. Of work and so forth.
Yes, so the way I think about this, of course you don't capture all sorts of mobility, and maybe so for some questions income would be better because it's easier to translate to welfare. Here I think this more sort of as a task mobility, so mobility from doing something else than your father in a task sense or in a sector sense. Yes?
But I think the point is that what it means to be, the notion of the occupation may not be stable over time.
No.
Right? So you can think of it as just a misclassification of sort of what the task actually is, right?
Yes.
So you really are being very upwardly mobile. Like a steel worker in 1850 90 would be doing something very different from a steel worker now
Mm.
and a mini mill.
Yeah.
But if you're interested in, say, ranks, as you are, say, Nathan, then you might say that occupations deliver on that, because we know that the rankings, as measured, say, prestige scores of occupations, are quite stable over time,
Yes.
even though the content of the occupation might shift.
So I don't impose any rankings on the occupations here. I leave them as unranked. Otherwise, we can get back to it when I discuss. I use large occupation groups like logging ferries, so we can get back to the question when we get to that.
Okay. I mean, also there's just these new occupations that emerge, right? Things like what's the analog in 1890 of computer programmer? Or
So I use white collar here as a category.
white collar.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
This is
that's
different from education. And you can apply all the same arguments
No, I
in this sort of
agree. No, I
multi-generational
agree.
stuff.
No, it just seems more dramatic though with occupation.
But he has prices. I don't understand. You can look at how you can sort of weight it by prices as well.
yeah, we get to that. So I'll try to.
Okay.
So my
Maybe
observation trip.
like some measure of welfare, though, right?
Yeah.
Measure of well-being, some utility index. Right?
So the problem is I don't have that before 1960s, so I don't use that for this long period. So I have 2 census years, and in 1900 I observe a person who is adult, who has an occupation. I link them to the previous census, and if this is before 1960, I use a combination of names and the place, their state they were born, and their age or their birth year, and sometimes birth date. So this link here is important. That's not based on residence or on the household structure, because I want to match people equally whether they move or whether they don't move. I'll get to the match rates later. And then I observe these people as children in the first census, and then I'm able to link them to their father by the family relationship information in that first census. So when I talk about father's and son's occupation, it's going to be father's occupation at one point in time, and then son's occupation in the second point in time. So mobility is then the association between this and this. And there's a lot to say about matching. I don't think I'll go too much into it. I allow for differences in the spelling of names and some discrepancy in the dates and the place of birth. It's fairly standard in these type of studies. I also allow for differences in last names. So people would sometimes state the residence of birth as their last name, where they would construct a patronymic based on their father's name. And in the 1920s, this would be standardized. So I allow for these naming custom changes. And because I have full counts, I can also rank the potential matches. So I'm able to, when I evaluate the match, I can see if it's unique or if there's any other good candidates. And if there are other good candidates, I have to have a stricter threshold for accepting the match of this person. So there's a lot of numbers here. This is just to talk about my match rates. So if you look at 1865 and 1900, like in the example, I have a universe of 246,000 people. So this is all the men that were alive by their age in 1865 that state they were born in Norway. And then I look for them, in this case in the 1865 census. I find 38% of them by a sufficiently good match. Then I see, do I know their father? Okay, for 72% of these people, I observe their father in the census, and I know this is the father of this person. And that gives a matched population of 66,000 for this particular transition. And then there's also the restriction that I want the father's age to be 30 to 60, because I use occupation at that age to alleviate the most extreme sort of start and end of life changes in occupation. And I need them to have a stated occupation to be, well, yes, I require them to be in the labor force, even though in the early period you state your occupation in any case, because that's as part of your identity. And that gives me my final sample. I also have a robustness sample that I don't use here, where I require these people to be between 0 and 15 at the first point in time. So that's mainly to improve this one. I match very few parents for this sample, because 1960, they have to live at home in 1960, and a lot of these people don't. But the results are fairly similar if I restrict it to them being children at time 0. And of course, for the later periods, I have 100% found, because we have national ID numbers. So that's not a problem.
Can you just explain again, maybe you said why you only get 40% in the
Yes.
top? Is that names, or is that data limitation?
Yes, so what it means is that I find the father in 1980, I find the son in 1980, and always find him in 1960. Then I ask, what was his father? Now, if he was already, say, 25 years old in 1960, and then 55 45 in 1960. He doesn't live at home. And the population registry is to a large extent based on the 1960 census. So that's the father is alive and working, but we don't know who he was.
So I'm thinking that, say, 1865 to 1900, there are 246,000 in 1900, is that? And only less than 40% are found in 1865.
Mm.
What are the 60%? What?
Wisconsin. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Like
No,
what?
that's why I go backwards. So Wisconsin, if I went forward, I have to allow for Wisconsin, right? Then go back. So I look at people. So there are people that are there, but that I can't match because their names are not unique enough, or that the misreporting is so high that they can't be identified.
Do you know how many you miss because you don't find them versus how many you miss because you find too many of them? So you have to rule out duplicate matches.
That will be easy to set up, but I haven't done it, so I should do that.
What is your overall assessment of how comparable these data will be over time by virtue of what seem to be perhaps more errors in the early periods?
Of course, that's a challenge. So we have this restricted sample where I restrict them to be younger, where these rates go up, and that doesn't affect the estimates at all. So that's one conjecture. But other than that, I find it's a bit hard to study that.
The concern is, I think I'm still misunderstanding the match here. So you've got 245,000 people who are above age 35 in 1900.
Yes.
You look for them in the 1865 census, you find 37% of them.
Mm.
And then you look for their father, you find 70% of those fathers. So there's two sources of sort of linking problems. One is, do you find them when you look back, and once you get to 1980, when you look back, you've got some kind of unique identifier that removes that kind of problem and gets you to 100%. Is that the thing that's going on?
You're talking about this?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a population registry. That's
Got
the
it.
same as
And so then, but then when you do that, you end up finding far fewer of their fathers, which seems kind of interesting and suggests something is.
Oh, that's the virtue of the time span here. That's shorter. So because I have people 30 to 60 here, I have people 10 to 30 here, right? No,
Why do you lose more fathers?
10 to 40.
Yeah.
So, and the 40-year-olds in 1960 don't live with their father, and then there's not a full registration of family relations. But if I restrict
What can you
myself
tell
to
the
the
team?
kids who are age 0 to 15 at time 0, so then there's 0 to 15 in 1960, then they're 20 to 45 here, then my match rates are comparable.
Thank you.
And here it's so much better because here the registry has been running for a long time. So they're all in there.
These are fairly good match rates, I mean, compared
Yes.
to what people used to get.
So I try to pick. There is a lot. Everyone defines their match rate differently. So I try to do the same exercise for a long and ferry study. And as far as I can understand, these two are the comparable match rates. So the same number for roughly for parents and lower for children, because in the US, of course, you have less identifying information, less granular information on birthplace and things like that. So that there's more duplicate matching. And then there's a paper by Abramitsky et al., which is, of course, a lot more challenging to match people between Norway and the US, because, as you know, the names when you arrived in the US were changed a lot by people writing them down, so it's more challenging. Yes?
So what about occupations? So it goes down by more than 20 percentage points. Is that people who are unemployed or?
Here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're out of the labor force, you're not in there. And that's apparently more of a problem. All men worked in 1865. That's not the case anymore. Yeah.
Why not keep that as a category of
Yes.
the underclass, if you will?
Yeah. I should do that. I haven't looked at that. And that's really interesting to see how much that drives. That could give a lot of interesting answers here. Okay, so occupations. I standardize this to 4 occupation categories. I only look at men, partly because the categorization of women changes a lot over time, and partly because I can't match women by last name because it changes at marriage. So I look at men 30 to 60 and their occupation in the long and ferry sense. In that I group white collars, farmers, and manual, skilled and unskilled together. This is partly to alleviate sort of time comparison problems with new occupations. When I want to use the same methodology on so far time span, I have to do this. It's also because in the early period, a lot of the categories are not as easy to eke out. So when people say, well, we just know that people were farmers. We don't know too much about the discrepancy in the farmers. except for the cotters or husbandmen, the non-independent farmers, which I classify as unskilled laborers rather than farmers, because they don't have independent control of the farm.
We also experimented a lot with breaking up white collar into high and low, professional, technical, and kindred versus sales and clerical, and also having a category of the most unskilled at the bottom. So sometimes trying it with 6 rather than 4 categories.
I looked at that a lot. So this one I'm not able to split because the data in the Norwegian census is not granular enough. This I split, and it really it makes for a larger increase in social mobility. But in Norway, the lower white collar group is extremely small in 1865 because we were not that sophisticated a country. So that really drives my methodology. That's going to inflate a lot the estimates. So in the end, I took it out of the presentation today. But it strengthens the results.
Part of the reason why we did the 4 categories too was that we were trying to compare 2 very different economies. The US and UK were at very different stages, so we purposefully used a very broad categorization scheme. And the big problem was farmers. Particularly in the US, farmers could be very well off or very, very poor, whereas in Britain, it was a relatively high status occupation. What's the distribution of farmers in Norway through this period? I mean, do you get everything from very wealthy to very poor, or is it more standardized like Britain?
No, so in the 19th century, you don't have the data, but there's substantial variation, both in the same societies and regionally, and also variation in the structure for different regions. So farms could be very small, but as I said, the very non-independent farmers, the husbandmen who had to work for the big farm, they're classified as unskilled, even though the results remain roughly the same if I put them here instead.
If there's not that much heterogeneity among farmers, you probably could rank them.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
you could
there is.
play with a rank.
Yeah, there is heterogeneity. Oh yes. So yes, so the methodology doesn't impose the ranking, as you said. So these are the marginal distributions. I was only able to construct comparable series for the United States because then you have the IPEMS data, so you can classify the occupations yourself. And you see that Norway is consistently below the United States on white collar, except for the very end. There was a lot of farmers, but perhaps for different reasons. So Norway had been the same country for a long time. The United States had a lot of free land and a lot of people coming in and using that land. You see industrialization taking place, and then change from skilled to more unskilled and white collar in the very late period. So turning to social mobility, this will be my unit of observation, right? I have 4 fathers' occupations and 4 sons' occupations. I'm going to study these matrices. So that's what I'm going to work with. So let's start with the transition probabilities. This shows the transition probabilities to the same occupation. So the probability of the son having the same occupation as the father over time. And this is the father's observation year that I've plotted it by. So you see that white collar, sons of white collar fathers always tend to become white collar workers themselves. And this is fairly persistent over time. And there's also, for the white collar sons, relatively stable share going into skilled occupations. That's not shown here. If you look at the farmers, in 1865, 60% are observed as farmers in 1900. And this is decreasing over time. And this is, of course, a feature of the large decrease in the number of farms. So there's fewer farm jobs to go around, and that means people mechanically are sort of driven into other occupations. Sons of skilled fathers, manual skilled, I'm going to just say skilled, are largely going into skilled occupations, but this is going down in the end also because of a change in the distribution. And in the final year, white collar is the most common occupation choice for all 4 groups of fathers' occupations. And there's also an interesting decrease here. So this decrease is much faster than what you would think just based on the marginal distributions. So there's still a lot of unskilled jobs to go around. But the recruitment is to a larger extent taken up by the, yes. The decrease in the sons of unskilled going into unskilled is faster than what you would expect from the marginal distributions. So this shows some tendencies to more mobility in that the persistence is going down for all these categories. But to study this more carefully, we of course have to take account of these changes in the marginal distribution. So this is what I suppose sociologists call relative mobility or fluidity. That's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation. So again, I'm basing myself on this Altam statistic from Ferry and Altam, or also from your paper, where you compare sons of 2 different occupations. The father has 2 different occupations. And you look at the probabilities of the sons of the white-collar worker becoming white-collar compared to skilled. And in the example, first time period, you have 75% here and 70% here. And then you do the same comparison for the son of the skilled worker. So what's the probability of him becoming a white-collar worker compared to a skilled worker? And then you look at the difference in this ratio and this ratio, like this. And that's the odds ratio, right? So the advantage of using the odds ratio here is that when the number of, if you think of the occupation, aggregate occupation development as being exogenous to these people's choices, then this corrects for the change in the marginal distributions of occupations. So you can interpret this as a change in relative mobility. So I'm going to talk about these odds ratios, and then this log of probability differences. So in this example, it's 2.15, which is a rather large number. And then I'm going to use this Altam statistic. That's an aggregate of all these odds ratios for all the 36 possible comparisons when you have 4 occupations.
So what does that number mean?
No, it's a measure. Yeah, so sorry, I should say that more carefully. So if there was full mobility, full relative mobility, all these probabilities would be, all these ratios would be 1, right? So this ratio would be equal to this ratio, and you get 1 here, and you get 0 here.
I mean, in terms of the aggregate measure.
Yeah, so this is a measure on how different is the matrix that I have, that I study. How different is that from a matrix where you have full relative mobility?
So it's used for ranking, or does it mean anything, the number coming out of it?
No, so the number is 0 if there's full mobility, and it's high if there's low mobility. And other than that, I haven't seen any convincing measure of the scale. So but I'm going to compare it to their US estimates and UK estimates, so we can see how different. So it's a measure of the distance between the full mobility matrix and the matrix we study in terms of relative social mobility. Jørgen?
Just follow up on that. Are you weighting by the number of people in each bucket in that scale? I can't.
No, I'm not doing that. I've been thinking a lot about it, of course. So this, I shouldn't draw too many lines to what you talked about yesterday, but this is, should you weight by the categories or by the people, right? And okay.
The concern is like you ideally think want some kind of robustness to like one guy coming in with a new job, or some notion of stability. I don't know.
Yeah. So this is why I'm going to discuss these categories separately first, and I can see when we aggregate it up if you think the aggregation makes sense or not.
I think this probably has to do with my confusion on relative versus absolute mobility. But this measure would be 0 if I had white collar, blue collar men.
Very difficult to hear you.
I'm saying
Very difficult to hear what you say.
this is going to have to do with my not thinking clearly about the distinction between relative and absolute mobility. But if I understand this correctly, if I had white collar, blue collar manual, and the transition probabilities were 0.1, 0.1, 0.8 in all cases, you would say that's a highly mobile society. But another interpretation is that even if a parent is white collar, they can't do anything to facilitate their child's position. And so I'd really put that on the table. At least for me, there's an intuitive or problem I have with not accounting for where the movements are.
So you're saying that basically, if there's the random society is fully mobile, is that your?
I'm
comment?
saying if the transitions are 0.1, 0.1, 0.8 for the 3 in my 3x3, that it by one definition, this measure you would say that's the most mobile notion. But what's disturbing there is the inability to build up, as it were, upward mobility within a dynasty.
Yes. So that's sort of maybe the welfare interpretation of this is not completely clear. Is that what
you
you're
should
saying?
go ahead.
Yeah,
As I said that.
Yeah, but it'll be interesting to discuss more later.
But here, you're not making any distinction. This goes back to this notion of price. I mean, I moved from white collar to skilled. That could represent in this transition either a move up in wages or a move down. Right? So it's very hard to separate out what the forces are. I mean, I guess when you're talking about social mobility, if you have like new opportunities opened up and people are moving, so I don't know, I guess there's the notion everybody might be initially equal, is that the notion? And then we can see how much they can equalize in terms of wages or payments. It's just very difficult. It seems like you might want to, upwardly mobile would be if I'm really moving towards higher incomes, right? So instead of using this metric, I would use an income metric, which is what we were suggesting earlier, right? So if I'd stayed in the previous, instead of one measure would be, had I stayed in the previous occupation, what would I have done? How much better off am I? And then having been what my parent would have destined me to be, something like that.
Yes.
But it's just not clear, so we talk about different ways of asking what this measure means. And it's hard to really talk about mobility without some notion of a welfare.
Yeah, so the problem is my wage data is really coarse, and I don't trust that for my main conclusions. I guess that's my problem here. I'm not willing to rank these occupations by the mean wages reported because...
I mean, like take the farming skill. You were farming, big sector in Norway.
Yeah.
So then the question was there a push? I mean, in the enclosure movement, there was a push, right? So in Britain, a lot of farmers were really laid off, and real wages, I think, I'm not an economic historian, I think they went down during that early period. These measures of well-being really went down. And so the question would be, would you consider that? You're not going to consider push versus pull notions of why the transition functions are what they are.
No, I'm not going to look at...
But you could, in principle, couldn't you?
Then I need income data, right?
Well, sort of conditions of demand and supply, I guess, technological progress.
Yeah, I have some sort of geographical decompositions. I'll try to get back to that. I haven't found much, but is it okay that we get to that when I talk about regional?
Sure. No, I'm just trying to understand the limitation or the interpretation of these measures.
So the way I see it, a lot of... Sorry? No, okay. So this odds ratio, the way they are constructed is that you take the sons of the white-collar father and you compare the probability that the son will become a white-collar occupation compared to a skilled occupation. And you see these shapes that I showed earlier for the white-collars. And you do the same for the sons of the skilled father. So you see in the end, the son of the skilled father is more likely to have white-collar occupations than skilled occupations. As I said, the ratio between these is basically odds ratio. That goes like this. And we can do this for all the comparisons. So here I've done it for the comparison between a white collar and skilled father. And this is white collar compared to skilled. This is white collar compared to unskilled. And this is skilled compared to unskilled. So this is just an example of three probabilities. And we see for this the advantage of the son of white collar in becoming a white collar occupation has decreased over time. And the same in the advantage of a white collar son of a white collar to become skilled rather than unskilled has decreased over time. Now we can compare this to Long and Ferris results for United States and Great Britain. And we see that if we take their last two observations, there's a similar trend in the US and Norway. And they have a completely different trend in between 1850 and 1880. But I don't have that time in mind, so it's hard to compare. But if you just look at this, and we see the development is much larger in Norway than in the United States. So the difference is in occupation choice, depending on the father's occupation, were much higher in Norway than in the US for this particular period. For England and Wales, the 19th century numbers are comparable, but the direction goes, the effect goes in the other direction. So there's even more persistence today than there used to be. And this is again from your paper. And so we can do this for all the comparisons, as I said. I'm not going to show you that, but I'm going to aggregate these three into one group. So basically we have 6 fathers' occupation comparisons and 6 sons' occupation comparisons. And I'm going to look at these 3 categories, which are all comparisons of non-farm fathers, so the effect of various non-farm occupations, on the probability difference between non-farm sons' occupations. And then you have the farmer fathers compared to sons of non-farmers, and you look at the occupations differences in the non-farm sector. And similarly, you have the non-farmer fathers and the movement into farming. And this is going to be the important one, the farmer, comparing farmer to non-farmer fathers in the outcomes, farmer, non-farmer for the son. So basically, this is the aggregates using the Altam statistics, squaring the odds ratios for these 6 categories. And if you first look at these 3, which is the non-farmer sons and the non-farmer fathers, we see a consistently downward trend in Norway. So the scales are different, so the size of the effect differs. But there's really a downward development. It's actually the same for the US for some of these, but there's this increase in the first period. And for Britain, the evidence is more mixed. Then if we compare the farmer and the non-farmer fathers and the probabilities of going into various non-farm occupations, we also see the same trend for Norway. So there was a huge difference in the occupation you got, depending on whether your father was a farmer or something else in Norway, to a much larger extent than in Britain and the United States. Similarly, if we compare the non-farmer and the farmer fathers, and the non-farmer sons, we see the same. But for the probability of going into farming compared to something else, that is, what is the importance of your father's occupation on your decision or your outcome of being a farmer? We see that in all countries, this goes in the other direction. So there's a much higher persistence, especially in Norway, to become a farmer, or especially in Norway and the US, to become a farmer if your father was also a farmer. So that is a large effect on the probabilities.
What's on the y-axis?
That's the square odds ratios for all these components that I had in the previous
That's
figure.
the all-time statistic.
That's if you sum all this and take the square root, that's the ultimate statistics.
So the reason you have to use something complicated like that is because you don't order them?
Yes.
But it has no meaning, right?
Hmm?
If the value is 40 or 50, or I can always transform that.
Yeah, that's why I'm comparing things. I'm not talking about number.
So why can't you just say do the weighted average of the odds ratios, or
This is the weighted
put
average.
some wages on it or something that makes it somewhat meaningful?
Yeah, so if you weight by wages, what would that mean? That would mean, well, how should I know if the results come from the wages or from the occupational movements?
You don't. I mean, I thought the problem with these other things is that you don't care where they're moving. So by having a ranking and by having wages or something, then you can start sort of aggregating things a bit more. It matters if I go from like the best category to the worst category. I mean, that's a different movement than just switching marginally off the diagonal.
Yes, but in a sense, I would say that's a different question. I'm looking at the how much it depends on the father's occupation in an unordered set. You could construct measures that look at ordering, but in a sense, I wanted to relate this to the existing work on this long-run probability and long-run occupational mobility, and that's why I did this.
Don't you want to condition these probabilities at least on the wages? Sort of what the average. I mean, the notion of mobility would really mean that, you know, this is an occupation that I'm really is desirable relative to where I'd stay if this is the notion I was talking about earlier. The fathers versus, if I stay with the father, it's kind of some kind of specific capital. I learn of my father's need, what his occupation is, so I know that's accessible to me. But then there's a relative wage between moving out of that occupation to another occupation. And I would guess the question would be, how free am I, to do that? I mean, there's a real benefit, right, of staying on where your father taught you. But presumably that nullifies when the real wages are declining in that occupation. So I'm a farmer, but real wages are declining in farming. So my social mobility is really impaired in some sense if I can't get out of farming quickly. So it's kind of the notion of a fluid labor market. I mean, how important are my initial conditions for that mobility transition? But the transition itself, from the theory of migration, would depend on relative wages, right? Just occupational choice.
So you want to decompose this in a sense into the advantage of learning your father's occupation and the pull from the relative wage change.
Yeah, but how much that's muted, the incentive it might be to get a higher wage in that occupation versus another. I mean, I don't know if the literature is doing that at all.
No, not as I know, but there's probably something I should.
Because why do I think of occupation? Occupation is giving me kind of an initial set of capitals. My father teaches me, a farmer. I see the farm, maybe I even get the farm. But for what it's good for or not. Some of these farms in a fjord don't seem very attractive, really, in terms of earnings, unless you get an OECD subsidy, I guess, or a European Union subsidy. But I mean, quite seriously, it seems like the notion of relative mobility is what's important, how well you can respond to market incentives, right? Isn't that a notion of mobility?
I agree completely. I think what I'm doing is one step further back from that. So I'm not doing the sort of push and pull factors. I'm just describing the change. And then one could ask what's driven by relative wage changes and what's driven by position advantage.
Demand shifts too, then, in terms of occupation.
So I'm not taking that step today, but I agree it would be a very interesting thing.
I mean, does anybody in the literature do that, though? In terms of, I mean, there are these studies in occupational choice, right? And they definitely talk about family income and family background and ability and tuition and so forth and so on. So I'm just trying to put those literatures together.
We're attaching wages in our multi-generational work. We're attaching average occupational wages to try to get at some of that, but that introduces a whole host of other
But like the relative wage, what the relative benefit would be in this had I stayed. It's not just so the measure of wage is kind of like coming up with the monetization of the occupation. But I'm thinking about what the choice probability would be. So I have this wage versus so just think about a discrete choice model. How free am I from initial conditions and choosing among all those different occupations?
I mean, the problem, of course, is that we don't actually have the wages. I mean, we like them, but we don't have them. There's huge variation among And you could assign an average wage to
Not
a
even some
farmer.
average measure of what an earnings would be?
Sure, but
Of a farmer in Nebraska in 1890? I would guess they would be, right?
if you had a,
But how do you
I don't
control
know. I
what
I haven't tried to find it, so.
what I worry about?
you
That
could
is,
get an average. The question is when you attach an average to these people.
yeah, I worry about the selection
No,
within the
it's
groups.
better than nothing, though, right? Some idea of what the relative opportunity would be.
There's a nice class of models that are nested within these kinds of odds ratio models in which you impose a metric on the occupations, be it occupation wage or socioeconomic status more generally, impose a metric and then see to what extent the odds ratios are explicable in terms of these socioeconomic or wage differences
Right,
between
that seems
occupations.
very easy.
And so you can do all that you're doing now and then build in this other very, very legitimate concern by imposing some sort of metric on the occupations and see to what extent the odds ratios are explicable with respect to those distances that the occupations.
Okay.
But use these adjusted odds ratios by what would be the alternatives? What would be the economic basis for choosing one occupation versus the other? You'd want to adjust for that, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the notion of mobility. If I'm stuck as a farmer in Mississippi, as opposed to migrating north to a factory, that's giving me some notion of immobility, right? That I mean, there's much higher wage in Chicago. I'm, picking cotton in southern in the Mississippi Delta. That would be truly a measure of immobility, wouldn't it? I mean, if there's a big wage gap in the standard of living.
Yeah, so that's okay.
Anyway, I'm just curious about the literature. It's not really doing that because there's a big literature on migration per se, right? And usually migration is occupational choice, at least in the U.S. largely, at least.
Yeah, then you use the average. I agree. So it's
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Anyway.
Okay, so what I do in this interpretation is I group this, I call this non-farm and farm non-farm mobility, and compare it to the farm mobility. That is the mobility that's driven. If we accept the Altam statistics for now, the mobility that's driven by the farmer fathers and farmer sons compared to all these other notions of mobility. And what I get is this decomposition of the Altam statistic, if you like. So if we look at all these odds ratios that do not involve both farmer fathers and farmer sons for Norway, they're plotted along this axis. Along this axis are plotted the sum of the odds ratios that involve either both farmer fathers and farmer sons, comparing them to other people. And what we see for Norway is there's a clear development towards less father-son association, more mobility over time in these non-farm sectors. But in the farming sector, there's a non-linear movement back and forth, and it's actually ending up with a more persistent, higher effect of father's occupation now than we had in 1865. If we compare this to Long and Ferry's results, which I'm a bit hesitant to do because they made the results and they had the right to interpret them, you see that in Britain you get a move, small moves as they find, small move towards more non-farm mobility and small move to less farm mobility. And the US can really be seen, a lot of the change in the US is driven by this farm persistence. Now, by the construction of the Altam statistic, you have the full mobility as a reference point in the 0, at the bottom right, and the distance from the origin is basically the Altam statistic. So these are the Long and Ferry numbers, and this is how Norway compares. And you see if you use both components, it's really not very clear, but once you break it down, you get a very clear movement towards 0, which is full mobility in Norway, compared to Britain and the US. So by this notion that does not include incomes, Norway was very little mobile in the 19th century. There was very high influence of father's occupation on son's occupation. And this has disappeared over time. And then we can't say if this was because of relative wages or skill transmission in this case, but that would be interesting to look at.
And again, the imposition of education. Again, I would thought at some point there must be public education established in Norway. I don't know what the history of it is.
It's established over this entire period. But it's unclear what they actually
much more
learned.
widespread. I mean, so there are a lot of highly educated farmers still stuck up in the fjords. I mean, I'm just curious what they
As it's hard to get the data on these things. So elementary education is just elementary education in the censuses, and no one has anything else until the 1960s. So it's hard to look at that. Okay, so this was the aggregate picture for Norway. And I have some more time, so I want to talk a bit about the sub-regions, because one of the ways I can try to get at some of this, how this works without using wage data, is to to look at subpopulations. For example, I can compare the rural and urban areas or the areas with high and low economic growth and see how this outcome statistic differs between these areas. I can also look at people who move location and compare them with people who stay in the same place and see what does that look like. So we could hypothesize that if you move location, you would have higher occupational mobility as well, because one type of mobility should induce the other type of mobility. And then, because people keep asking, and because it's a good idea, I've compared people with areas with high and low immigration to see if the high immigration areas have high mobility, which would perhaps be my prior, that if people leave, then there's more place for the people who remain to move up in the world. But it could also be that the people who emigrate are the people who would drive the mobility, so that you get lower social mobility. So I'm sorry that there's a...
And the reason why they emigrated in the first place is another factor, right?
Yeah.
You know, negative shocks.
Yeah, so yeah, that's true. I should have that. Yeah, I remember that. So this is the non-farm components where I found this huge increase in mobility over time. And you see that rural-urban difference is not really large. So, well, the matrices are different, but the numbers are not very big. So it's the same movement. There's no trend. It's not driven by the urban or rural areas. Similarly, you find slightly higher mobility in the areas with below slightly high mobility when there's high income growth, but it's not very strong suggesting evidence that income growth is driving this mobility, at least on the regional level.
But you're using very long periods when you're measuring
yes.
moving to the US. And it's sort of a big change. Let's say they started in 1860, 65 and ended in 25 or something. There are big differences where they were moving from.
Yes. So because I only have these censuses, I have to average over long time periods, and that makes it more challenging to look at these things, of course. But the people who move have higher mobility, especially in the early periods. So you see, if you look at non-farm mobility, they have higher mobility than the people who stay, except for the people who move from one countryside to a different. They look similar. And finally, the local emigration rate. The difference, there is some evidence. Let me get that right. There is some evidence of lower mobility in high emigration areas in the first period, which maybe would suggest that the poor and industrious emigrate, while it changes in the second period, but it's not really conclusive. And of course, after 1930, this emigration stopped, so it doesn't make sense to split the population after that. So I have some more time. I've been trying to think about how we also can use this regional variation in a more systematic way. So when I talk about social mobility today, I've talked about how the occupation of the son depends on the occupation of the father. But if you have a farmer father, then you're more likely to live in a farming area. So you're more likely to be a farmer for that reason as well, right? It's not just the father, it's the area that you live in. So we could call this neighborhood effects. I'm very concerned that I will step on some notions that are very precise that I'm abusing here, so you have to correct me if I do that. So one hypothesis would be then that if we correct for this region of origin, then the measure of intergenerational occupational mobility would go down, because we're really capturing neighborhood effects and not father effects. So the way I think about this, was to set up a multinomial logic model where you had three equations where you compare these three other categories to the probability of the son having a white collar occupation, and you use dummies for father's occupation. And as far as I could tell, if you just have these dummies, then this is equivalent to just using the matrices, right? Because it's the same information and you can do the likelihood and it turns out nicely. And what I then do, or try to do, is to add covariates to this equation. So we're imposing additivity and no interaction here, but other than that, this should be at least a way of descriptively examining the effect of covariates on the region or individual level.
It's basically like a choice question. I mean, you're essentially doing what I think Jim is asking for.
Right, this is a multinomial logic version of a choice equation.
Yeah, I guess.
But you could put in relative wages on the XQ.
Yes, and I haven't done that.
Be just a function, the function of K and Q, like the relative wage difference between occupation K and W.
And this is capturing the time variation in this thing? I mean,
no, so now I use this on separate time periods. I don't impose any common structure over time because it changes.
So I thought sort of what we only get at is changes in the demand side, or changes in industry structure, maybe instrument with prices.
Right.
I mean,
yes, I'm not
I think the whole thing is about dynamics here. I mean,
I haven't done that. No.
I think it'll be very interesting.
Yeah.
But we know, like in the 19th century, when the Great Plains were developed, the price of wheat fell dramatically, and that had a huge implication for European agriculture, didn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what the grain was being produced in a lot of these Norwegian farms. Price of grain really went down dramatically. It must have had real wage consequences.
You
Right?
must have done on trade prices. I mean, there must be
On
on prices in international trade. I mean, there must be good.
yeah, so there's good food prices, but the problem is the long.
This paper by Rosenzweig and Schultz, remember, it was, fertility is very different. They came up with a grain price for Sweden anyway, right? That was relevant for like 200 years, wasn't it about right? I mean, you can just look at the grains, and the grain price was very closely related to the income. They were using it to look at the income of women versus men in agriculture, but the idea would be very comparable here, what the relative prices were, just the payments for what the final demands were. I mean, I don't know whether Norway was industrializing, but it was engaged in sea trade, right?
Yeah.
So I imagine it was larger. I don't know whether it went up or went down in the commercial
Yeah, and
trading,
it
fishing
fluctuates.
and so forth. So I don't know what happened to the price of fish during the, but presumably there's some data on each of these things, right? That's going to affect these occupational choices. So that would be your instruments, right?
What you want is an interaction between D and X to
Yeah,
say
right.
to what extent those D attenuate the effect of X.
Yeah,
You don't
exactly.
want to add to structure.
Right.
But that would be fine.
In terms with all the relative prices, how does it affect this as a descriptive measure of the level? I mean, the relative price is the same for the sons of farmers or for the sons of professionals.
No, but the trends would be different. So I mean, if you think of these as investment decisions, the fathers grow up under one set of expected prices, and the sons grow up under another. So farming is being wiped out. So the relative wages would be changing across generations. It's true at a point in time they face the same prices, but the expected earnings streams
Right, but it's
would be
still
very
true
different.
that if there is perfect mobility, the index they're using is zero. If it's perfect immobility, is infinite, and that's true in all cases. The range is the same. If all the people are in the diagonal, you have infinite, perfect rigidity, right? So it's still
That would be a
true.
measure of mobility, yeah. People were completely, but you think initial conditions would matter, right? That's the notion of getting occupation-specific capital from your father.
No, in notion, it matters a lot causally. I'm seeing as a measure, as a descriptive measure of the level of, and this is what I understand he is trying to do in this presentation, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it matters.
Well, but if it's 0.2, what does that mean? I mean, this is just like Gini. I mean, the endpoint has an interpretation, but the number has no interpretation. I can do any monotonic transformation of this, and the number doesn't mean anything different, right? I mean, you say that you know what the max and the min mean. The 0.5, I mean, what's that number mean? 0.4, what's that number mean?
Okay.
I mean, the Altam statistics, for I understand, has no cardinal interpretation except from the endpoints. Maybe I'm misinterpreting something, but sort of the graphs we see in the sort of how the numbers change have no interpretation. I mean, I can make any transformation, I get a different number.
But you can do the ranking, right?
Yeah, for ranking, but
Right. So and this is understand what I never heard any interpretation in terms of it decreased 50%. He said this is the trend, it's decreasing or increasing.
Yeah.
And I think that is still valid without any relative price.
it can be epsilon change or a big change, and I want another number.
Well, yeah.
Well, the ranking matters. It'd just be useful to know why the ranking is changing. That's all.
So basically, this is just a descriptive exercise where I add covariates for the father's region, either by the mean occupation of his area of living, where the son grew up, or other characteristics of where he grew up, to see if it affects the Altam statistics, what we're relying on here, because then I can just use the BRAS to get the Altam statistic.
Can I ask why you did this maneuver? Because your setup surprised me a bit. I thought that you were very interested in region-specific demand. So, for example, if you're in a farming-intensive region, there are a lot of parents who are farmers, but there's also, in effect, a big demand within that region for farming.
Yes.
And I thought then, if that's your concern, why not have region-specific mobility tables in which you allow that demand that an individual's facing to be region-specific?
Yes.
And then calculate odds ratios conditional on those margins that are now region-specific.
Yes.
Why did you go that way?
No, so I looked a lot on odds ratios and tried to regress them on covariates to see how they vary systematically with the characteristics of the municipalities. Does that answer part of your question?
Well, even a more primitive maneuver would have been just to allow those marginal effects to be region-specific.
Right.
And then to relate those region-specific effects to some of these prices.
Yeah, so I should use prices because I mainly use descriptives like occupation shares, and that doesn't drive much. had very hard time finding systematic variation in the odds ratios based on the covariates that I have, which is municipal mean income and the occupation shares from the censuses. What I have not done much is the prices, so that might be possible to find something there, the changes in prices. Okay, so I'm almost out of time. I just want to show you that there's no large change in the trends in the Altam statistic when you control for these regional dummies. So the estimate goes down, as you would expect, but as Magne says, it's hard to interpret the change in the level of the Altam statistic. So
But
what
the
they want...
regional dummies are really quite important.
I mean,
Or not.
no, it doesn't change. It goes from 24. The trend is now from 21 to 16 compared to from 25 to 19. So it's still the same trend in the aggregate Altam statistic. So there is no. So again, I don't want to interpret it cardinally. So I'm just saying that, well, the trend is not driven by this regional dummies, regional variation changing. So the final thing, I'm almost out of time, right? Oh, great. So this is my wage data, and it's based for 1865 on tax incomes, tabulations of taxes paid. Then I have tabulations for 1910, and I use the 1967 income data, which is the earliest, on the 1960 occupation. So there's a lot of challenges in constructing this income data. And just because I wanted the more economic interpretation that with a measure people can relate to, I thought of using the dynastic income inequality on occupations, by imposing incomes on occupations. Because then I could try to swap out, like Magne does in his marriage paper, the actual mobility matrices with hypothetical mobility matrices from other periods, or full mobility, to see how that affects this dynastic income inequality. So, yes, let me explain. So, in 1865 to 1900, if you add the income of the father and the son, and deflate it by the growth, so we could just use relative to mean incomes, you get a Gini of 15 or 16. This goes up to 19, down to 11, down to 8. So it's very low in the final period because the white collar group is very big, and I impose the same income of all of them. These are the fathers and sons. So the sons are similar if you go diagonally. So what happens then if we take the marginal income distribution from 1865 and 1900 and swap out the mobility that actually took place with a different mobility matrix? That is a different set of odds ratios that's imposed on the matrix with the same marginal distributions. What happens? This is what happens. So basically, if you look at the first period, the actual dynastic income inequality is 16, which is coincidentally exactly the same as what you would have if we just had full mobility. That is Durlav's random society, where there's no association between father and son's occupation at all. And this is because the change in the marginal distribution is so big that it drives all of this income inequality. Compare this to the next period, where there's really a huge difference. There's a difference between this and this. This is because now the marginal income distributions have stabilized more, and then there's a substantial contribution from mobility that decreases the dynastic income inequality. You will see again that even though these matrices are quite different, they're not so different that it would change this welfare measure if we swap them out. You have to swap them out for something more dramatic, like the lowest possible mobility or the highest possible mobility, to get any effects. This is just one attempt of making an economic interpretation that doesn't impose too much on this wage data that I use. So, to summarize, I find a great increase in intergenerational mobility in Norway over time. Composition of this decrease in rigidity has been different from the United States. This is in line with existing results on earnings in Norway and Sweden. But there is some trends of the increase in inequality, and also some results that suggest a decrease in mobility in the very last periods, like Piketty has argued for inequality. I think the reason I don't find this might be because I have white collar as a large group, and there's a lot happening within that group that I can't control for when I look at these long time periods. If I split it, however, I still don't find an increase in the last period. So that's one split would not be enough to account for that. So, but there's plenty of scope within occupation inequality. I can't say that this is driven by regional convergence, but I should attempt more ambitious identification strategies there. Yes. So finally, there's a lot of things I want to do with this data in the future. So this was sort of a descriptive based on the first pass on this data. And I hope to get back with more things later. Thank you.